Namaste, viewers. Welcome to Jaipur Dialogue USA. And today we are going to talk about a very simple matter. A very simple matter. I'm calling it simple primarily because all the dust and heat and excitement has settled following Prime Minister's visit to the United States, which was remarkably successful. To discuss that, where do we stand going forward in the relationship? We have two brilliant minds, strategic thinkers who have been in the business of politics, geopolitics, for a very long time. One of them is Mr. Kawal Sibbal ji, and a prominent diplomat who has been ambassador in many countries. I don't need to spend time here to tell you his glorious assignments. All you need to do is Google Mr. Kanwal Sibbal, and you will see the plethora of activities and successes that he has to himself. And Dr. Adityanji, who I know very well, welcome to the show. He's a psychiatrist, a study of psychiatry from All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi. And he runs a practice of his own and also very deeply involved in strategic analysis and geopolitical work. He has set up an NGO, what we call a 50c3n organization in the United States, which is Council of Strategic Affairs, and of which, as a full disclosure, I'm also a board member. So we are trying to understand the dynamics of the entire process. So Kawalji, I will come to you first, that now that the whole dust has settled, the excitement has ebbed, and things are back to normal after Prime Minister's visit, how do we see after the storm has gone past, after the bubble has gone past, after the excitement and the fireworks and lightning has gone past, how does the scene look now from your eyes? Because there was tremendous excitement. India and the United States have been defined on by many words, the largest and strongest democracies, the pivotal relationship, natural allies, consequential relationships. All kinds of words have been used. But sometimes, to bring a film analogy, my mind says, it's like a Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman love affair. You know, both are beautiful people, get along very well, but as in the United States, they say, we love each other so much, but we can't live with each other. Your thought on that? Adityanji, before Kawalji joins, I have the same query with you too, with reference to the fact that the entire US relationship, how do you see it?
I see that it is growing incrementally. We have seen since 1947 the vicissitudes of India-US relationship, and since probably 1998 onwards, it has transformed, metamorphosed, and it has grown despite challenges. And the challenges are from both the sides. In United States, it depends who is heading the administration. The life of the administration averages 4 hours, 4 years, and if they last for another term, the same momentum is carried out. And if another party acquires the presidency, sometimes the tunes change. So that being said, over last 2.5 decades, India-US relationship has progressed incrementally. We are in far better situation now than we were in late 1990s. But there are other factors that we need to understand that impinge on India-US relationship. Yes, government of India, government of United States, but there are other actors that sometimes impinge on the relationship and tend to bring it down. So in India, generally it is said the bureaucracy stymies any new initiative. What people do not realize that there's an equally entrenched bureaucracy in the State Department, in Pentagon, and they never work in unison, and there are issues there. As United States administration creates new Mandarin positions or new structures like USCIRF, like International Ambassador for Religious Freedom, there's a lot of noise created by US bureaucracy that impinges on the nature of India US relationship. So I'll give you an example. The relationship was going very well during Bush years. The civil nuclear deal was signed. Bush did a lot of heavy lifting about India, all that sort of thing. Comes Obama administration. There was, lukewarm relationship. And towards the end of Obama administration, just one person, you know, an attorney, a US prosecutor in New York, Preet Bharara, did something that did incalculable damage to India-US relationship. And if you remember that era, they were in entrenched positions when Devyani Khobragade was arrested despite her diplomatic immunity, and the relationship nosedived. So we need to understand that whatever prime minister wants, whatever president wants, there are entrenched interests on both sides that sometimes impinge on the relationship. But the tendency is to always blame the Indian bureaucracy. There's a term used these days, and that is called deep state. So deep state always remains in United States. The governments come and go, and sometimes the president is there only for 4 years. So whatever happened in Trump era probably is not being pursued by the current administration. And if next year in the elections a new government comes, there may be a different tune. Having said that, overall the relationship has prospered. Of course, these are two different countries with different geographical locations, so their interests are different. They cannot be totally aligned permanently. Each country has its own geopolitical interests, and as we say in international relations, there are no zero sum games. India has its own independent sovereign right to conduct its foreign policy experience. With any country she desires, enter into partnership, relationship with any country, of course, following the international law. And it should not be at the expense of United States. And similarly, United States should not expect from India that, having good relation means India being totally subservient to US interests. That's not going to happen. So damper in the relationship and expectation comes when mandarins on one side think that, yes, India is in our camp. India is never a camp follower. India can never be anybody's camp follower. Let that be very well known. And this has been acknowledged by a State Department that India is going to be a great power. We are going to have good relations, but India would never be a formal US ally. And that's the nature of what I call doctrine of Indian exceptionalism. India has survived since independence, has taken very bold independent stands. Sometimes they have helped India, other times they have not helped India. By no stretch of imagination, any government that comes in India, be it current government, be it a different government, different coalition, India's foreign policy will be not to be subservient to a single country. And that needs to be heard loud and clear by all the power blocks. But
Thank you. Thank you for your brilliant opening statement. Kawalji, coming to you, sir. Connection thoda garbad ho gaya tha. What is your take on the Prime Minister's visit? And Adityanji was saying that India will never be a camp follower of America or any country in the world. How do you see this relationship genuinely moving forward, given the global interest, geopolitical interest arising on account of the report as well that many countries do not like China anymore? So is it China-centric? Is it driven by common elements, or is it driven by divergent elements that creates a convergence?
The relationship between United States and India is extremely complex. For that matter, the relationship between United States and even its allies is very complex. Look at what's happening between US and Europe. I'm sitting in Paris. I've had talks with people here, and the general view is that America is the one who's going to gain the most from what is happening in Europe today, and Europe is being damaged very severely. Japan is always very nervous about, especially during Trump era, about where United States might be going with China. Trump was even talking to the North Korean leader, causing
Right.
great concern to Prime Minister Abe. The Southeast Asian countries do not want to take sides between United States and China. They want to have the best of both worlds: security from the United States, but economic development and support from China. Uh, Look at United States relations with Pakistan, the ups and downs of that. Africa has been neglected by United States for many, many years. Now that there is the China challenge, they're trying to regain their foothold in Africa. Uh, Latin America has always had very serious problems with the United States. Now, I'm drawing this picture in order to show that any expectation on our part that our relationship somehow would be very different and that will be smooth sailing, it will have no ups and downs. Both countries will be always on roughly on the same wavelength. I think that's a wrong expectation. We should be realistic, pragmatic, and see how our relationship with the United States can be built in a manner where we can gain the most from it in terms of our objectives, which is economic development, technology development, and greater influence globally, because it is a fact that close ties with the United States certainly help us in terms of relationship with the US allies, who always look to the United States to see what it's doing with India in order to then follow suit. On the United States side, they would like to leverage India in accordance with their interests, and they have the following interests. One, of course, what you mentioned is China. I'll come back to that a little later. The other is the economic one, which has always been there. They have in the past been disappointed because India was a closed economy. Now India is opening up. India is actually taking initiatives to become even closer to the United States in the economic area. And they see now, because of the difficulties with China, this huge, huge market in Asia. The Indian giant is now rising, and they think that even if they're not able to profit from the economic openings in India as they could do with China, still with this with our population 1.4 billion, young population, with a lot of pent up demand, huge prospects of satisfying the consumerism in India, which in any case will expand phenomenally as our as our growth rates go up and our per capita incomes go up, and then the human talent.
Right.
They're seeing what 4 million Indians plus in the United States are able to achieve.
Hmm.
This gives them a clue that India has the potential if we can get our act right, and they want to be able to use this potential to global advantage, to US advantage, because India is going to become the provider of manpower, trained manpower, skilled manpower, which the developed economies sorely need because of aging populations. So these are the variety of factors which will give a certain dynamism and stability to the ties, even as what was rightly mentioned by Dr. Jitanji, there will be issues that will remain: human rights issues, minority issues, democracy backsliding, stuff like that, because there are these elements, forces, groups, NGOs, activists in United States, in which unfortunately many Indians are taking part also, which want to keep pushing this agenda because it has become part of our domestic politics in India. So you have the Indian opposition politicians and activists actually wanting the United States to raise these issues again and again. So our then decision has to be how much importance should we give to this. Uh, yes, we should push back, but should we make this the centerpiece of our attitude and approach to the United States at the cost of the larger gains that we may derive from this relationship. Now, this is where the art of diplomacy and political handling comes in, that we push back where is necessary, but we don't push back to the point that actually what these elements, these we want to achieve in terms of uh, spoiling the India-US ties. In fact, their objectives are well served because India reacts very, very sharply. So I think I would conclude by saying that what is being done today is that we are laying the foundations of a much more elaborate and intensive relationship, and that's where the whole thing about the ICET comes in, because that is the crux
Right.
of what the two sides want to achieve and benefit from each other. And then, of course, there is the issue of defense. The United States has always wanted uh, to have a, well, they initially began by sanctioning us, and denying us not only missile and nuclear technologies, but even defense equipment because of Pakistan and things like that. Now that has changed, but now they're on a different tack. They want to be able to sell more and more to India and do more and more in the area of defense, because they want to displace uh, the Russia as India's principal defense partner, and they've been saying it openly. They've been saying it openly. They have not made any bones about it. And then they are measuring our seriousness in developing our ties with the United States on the basis of what we can do in terms of buying defense equipment from the United States. We bought 20 billion. Now we are going to buy these Reaper drones, and we are going to collaborate in developing this F414G engine for our Tejas and advanced Tejas fighter aircraft. But they're now going to let go. They're going to keep pressing us to buy more and more from them in the area of defense. And then, of course, it is up to us how we play our game, uh, because we have to make sure that if we had eggs too much in the Russian basket, we shouldn't have our eggs in the US basket, for heaven's sake, because Russia has never sanctioned us. France has never sanctioned us. But the United States has a history of sanctions, not only on India, but on the rest of the world. You can see what they're doing even today. So, do we want to be trapped in a situation where we become dependent or over dependent on the United States, and then United States uses that as a leverage, as they have demonstrated in so many cases, which will then put us in a very difficult situation. And hence, therefore, this whole issue of strategic autonomy, of being independent in our foreign policy making, to the extent that it's possible in today's globalized world. But that part of our diplomacy we have to nurture, nourish, and protect very seriously, so that we keep our options open. Our diplomacy continues to have the flexibility we need, and hence we are part of ITU2, we are part of Quad, we are strong supporters of the Indo-Pacific concept. We got a new Quad now with India, United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and we are part of SCO, we are part of the BRICS, um, and we are strengthening a relationship with these other organizations which I just mentioned, because that gives us flexibility and makes both sides court us. Because given our rising stature and our weight in international affairs and the leadership of the global south that we are now assuming, both sides have an interest to draw us into their orbit to the extent it is possible. And that, of course, again, as I said, gives us a good scope to continue to pursue our interests in a pragmatic way, so that our relationship with all sides remains balanced in a kind of an equilibrium, so that we can then maneuver and pursue our interests in an enlightened manner.
Oh, that was a wonderful statement from a former diplomat who still remains a diplomat. Very balanced, very nuanced. I wanted to ask you the element that you talked about, that the U.S. Defense Department would want India to buy its hardware from United States. You very rightly said that India can't put all its eggs in the one basket, the Russian or American. So India remains, center to the demands of the Defense Department. At the same time, the State Department, through the human rights and other issues, they keep pinpricking India on that. And you are very correct in saying that we have to choose issues that we contest, issues that we let go. However, there is a very important point that comes in. There are certain times one tiny prick breaks the bubble. Do you think at some point in time these unnecessary human rights issue will be the last straw on the camel's back insofar as India is concerned? Because, as you very rightly said, United States deals with other non-democratic nations. There is no such USCIRF or Amnesty International talking about their human rights record, but India always becomes one. So is the US Department, Defense Department and the State Department play 1-2 punch? Good
Well,
cop, bad cop?
look, it's like this. United States has been raising these human rights issues with China, on Uyghur issue, on Tibet. They in fact appointed a special envoy for Tibet. I don't know if they appointed one for the Uyghurs. Maybe they have. They do raise these issues with China. At the same time, look at the volume of their trade with China. Huge, over $700 billion. It hasn't affected that. The American companies are not really decoupling from China. In fact, the U.S. Treasury Secretary and others are openly saying there's no question of decoupling. We want to de-risk, which really means that they, in certain critical areas, they don't want to become over-dependent on China. But for the rest, they will continue to do business as usual. What I mean is that the United States, while it raises human rights issues and everything else, looks at how far they can go in trying to exploit the weakness of a country and use those tools in order to extract political gains. They have not been able to do that with China because China is powerful, and United States knows that beyond a certain point, they're not going to be able to push China. In the case of India, there is a perception because we are an open democratic society, and they have lobbies inside our country, very powerful lobbies inside our country. Some of our political leaders actually go to the United States or appeal to the United States to actually raise some of these issues. And if they are raised by US International Commission or Religious Freedom or Freedom House or whatever else, they play it up. They, in fact, use those arguments and those attacks against our government as part of their own politics back home. So United States is able to derive more leverage from this. But on the other hand, I think at this point in time, there is a recognition in the United States that India is becoming far too valuable to them in terms of pursuing uh, their power politics in the world and maintaining their preeminent position. And therefore, this huge country like India, which is the only one in Asia that can stand up to China, it must remain by and large in the US orbit, in the US democratic orbit, uh, so that United States can leverage us. So that has, I think, introduced a degree of how should I, caution in their approach on these issues. Look at what happened during Prime Minister's visit, where Biden, in the joint press conference, went on to say that democracy is in the DNA of both countries, and this is happening despite what State Department does and human rights reports and everything else. Of course, he's being attacked, and there are others now very busy. The press, New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, all those are busy now trying to roll back a little bit. That came out from Prime Minister's visit, and what they felt was a good report card that was given to Prime Minister Modi personally and to India on democracy and human rights issues. But this is a game that will continue, and as I said, we should push back. We should not take it lying down. Uh, but we should not get, we can actually get into that mode, but that doesn't help us. That we list also all the deficiencies on human rights score of the United States, which are far more historically and today than in the
Right.
case of India. But supposing you get into those polemics, how does it help us? I think we should push back, point this out, reasonably and in a balanced way. Don't get cowed down. Hit back as we do at the U.S. International Commission of Religious Freedom. We hit back at them. We hit back at Amnesty. We are curbing the operation of NGOs in India, foreign funding in India. We're doing everything that is necessary in terms of uh, uh, putting some roadblocks in the efforts that these agencies in the West uh, have uh, uh, have been doing in the past in terms of uh, creating internal issues for us in India as a way of putting pressure on us. So that's sort of a thing we are doing, and I think they are noticing that. So let's see. I think it's a game that will continue to be played. There's no easy solution because, but as I said, as we grow more and more powerful, as our economy expands, as we become the third largest in 2027, uh, things will begin to change because the shift of global political and economic power away from the West is very palpable, is very real. And they cannot now, the transatlantic community cannot rule the world any longer. They have to find allies. China is not an ally, Russia is not an ally. Who are the allies? Japan is already an ally. Some key Southeast Asian nations are already some sort of allies. India is very, very vital. There's no other country which has the profile of India. So therefore, I think that will give a certain degree of capacity to us to be able to handle our relationship with the United States in a way that we leverage it to the maximum extent in our interest and push back the United States where they exceed certain bounds.
Thank you very much for bringing out a very important element that India is the only country that can contain China. Believe it or not, at Yale University several years ago, actually more than 10, I would guess, Tom Friedman had made that statement in a setting in which he said that more than China, regardless of its economic scale up in relationship with the United States, it is India that will play a vital role. And as we see going forward, somewhere along the line, United States has acknowledged this factor that India remains a critical player. And you very rightly said that the transatlantic relationship economies of the Western world is not going to dominate. That brings me to a question that always has bothered me, and I would like to have your input in this. That there is only one military alliance in the world, and that is NATO. Somebody said in a very interesting way that it's a white man's club made as an exception with only the Turkey being added to that. So it's a white man's club. It's a European club for their territorial imperatives, the gameplay that they have from time to time, somehow, somewhere on the line, and they dominate the United Nations, and its United Nations is being run by NATO. The 5 Security Council members are today fighting the battle in Ukraine. No scenario on that. Where is peace? Do you think if China were smart, they would form with India a Pacific Treaty Organization? How does the West world tolerate a military alliance called NATO that imposes its will on rest of the world? And I think you earlier alluded to the fact that who wants to be sanctioned by the West, particularly America? Nobody wants that. Your thought on that?
Well, insofar as NATO is concerned, the genesis of NATO is its security in Europe. Before the Ukraine conflict, there was big concern whether NATO was going to survive, what was the rationale for NATO to exist. Russia was not a threat anymore. In fact, Obama was very, very contemptuous towards Russia, if you remember,
Yes.
and towards Putin as a regional power. It's Saudi Arabia with a petrol, whatever else, that kind of stuff. And personally, he was very contemptuous of Putin also. So then they found that since United States itself could not manage all its external operations because they didn't have legitimacy, they wanted to get legitimacy. Therefore, they had these NATO out of area operations, whether in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, uh, in order to give some life and some rationale to NATO. But look what happened. The Middle Eastern military interventions have been a disaster, and the Afghanistan intervention has been a disaster. So it has been a disaster for NATO. In fact, President Macron, a few months ago, said that NATO is brain dead. This was before the Ukraine conflict began. Uh, now, uh, the Ukraine conflict and the open confrontation with Russia has given life to NATO, has given political life to NATO, has given military life to NATO. And NATO therefore wants to now spread its wings across the seas. And Japan, unfortunately, to my mind, is ready to play ball, is interested in having a NATO office in Tokyo, which brings NATO one way or the other, directly and indirectly, into the Indo-Pacific, which then creates problems for us. Because as it is, the other three Quad members are allies. But Japan was not a member of NATO, it still may not become a member of NATO. But if NATO puts its foot on the ground, then our maneuverability becomes less. And then all that what China and Russia are saying, we can discount what China is saying about Quad being a Asian NATO. But we don't want Russia to begin to believe that there may be some kernel of truth in this. So when NATO is challenging Russia and Europe, and we, for some reason, are brought into some kind of a, NATO fold of some sorts, directly and indirectly, it can create big problems for us in terms of managing our ties in Asia, especially with Russia. Uh, that is one aspect. The other is there was this move in the U.S. Congress to give a NATO plus status to India. I think that is absolutely ridiculous.
Yes.
Absolutely ridiculous. And although it may have been done out of goodwill in order to show that the two countries should become closer, but actually, what does NATO intend to do today? What NATO wants to do today is to use their combined military power to dominate the world. Since they can't dominate the world economically, it's not possible. And they have a very serious military challenge from both Russia and China. And Russia and China developing their strategic ties, become closer to each other, increases their military challenge. You can see how much Americans are continuing to say again and again, and the Europeans to China, you must not help Russia militarily in Ukraine, otherwise we'll
Right.
impose sanctions. They are worried. They're coming together. So in that context, uh, we should not become part of this power play and facilitate the return to Western domination of the world through military means on the
Right.
back of NATO. And that will actually reduce our margin of maneuverability. And I would be very much against any kind of linkage with NATO. NATO is not a peace-oriented organization. Let's face the fact. It is
Correct.
not. It doesn't have any economic agenda. It has no peace agenda. It has no technology agenda. It has only a military agenda. And our aim is to become strong militarily on the basis of our own Atmanirbharta, building our defense manufacturing at home, tying up with various countries in order to be able to uh, strengthen ourselves uh, in the defense domain. And it'll. What are we going to gain by becoming linked to NATO this way, that way, or the other? Now, I'm sitting in France, and we've just had a meeting of our visit of our prime minister, where some major decisions have been taken on the defense side, whether it is with regard to the submarines or with regard to the uh, Rafales for our new aircraft carrier. But more importantly, or equally importantly, uh, the development of engine together right from scratch, including design for AMCA, along with Safran, and then some very serious uh, issues uh, not serious issues, some serious progress with regard to space cooperation. Because now you can see how space-based capabilities are vital for even military operations. But our satellites are totally vulnerable. So far, they have not been attacked, but they can easily be attacked and put out of function. Therefore, how to develop some kind of uh, defenses in space in terms of protecting our satellite communications is something that has been put on the anvil with France. So these are the sort of things that we can do bilaterally with countries which are more amenable to treat us more equally and not press us to become members of their camp, as it were, before they open doors to us of technologies and everything else. So this is the road down which we need to go, and there's no need for us to go to Brussels and hobnob with the NATO. With NATO.
Absolutely, totally agree with you. I'm delighted to hear your thoughts on it because that's something which had been bothering me for a long time. I could not, sitting in America, I could not call that NATO is a white man's club or club, which it is actually. So, it's a part of an intellectual conversation. Sometimes we need to call things as they are. Otherwise, they look very different, and otherwise, we are not dealing with reality. Coming back to the same issue, this is very, you are sitting in Paris. There is a definite conversation going on about the so-called Paris Club, real or imaginary, that the entire regime change thing is being, that is the Paris is the hub of it all. And there are certain accusations flying in and out that Paris is the hub for a regime change operation in India in 2024. I don't need to give you the names here, but the one thing which I came to know that the United States has willy-nilly accepted the reality that in 2024, most likely Modi ji will come back to power. The current government will come back to power. As the saying goes, you win by a run or a wicket or a goal. A win is a win. So if Prime Minister doesn't get the same huge majority, even then it is a win, regardless of the play by so-called INDIA. Having said that, they have accepted, but they also would prefer, as you rightly said earlier on, a compliant, submissive, Rahul Gandhi or an, non-BJP opposition because Modi ji can't be bought. The man's integrity is absolutely solid. How do you see this regime change working, operation going on behind the scenes, accepting at one place, but trying to make a change using
Look,
the State Department
no,
tools?
I think it is true that there are elements in France who have always been active on this front. There was this, report by the Reporters Sans Frontières about, uh, you know, curbing of freedom of speech and restrictions on journalists in India. Uh, and yes, to some extent, some French intellectuals uh, do give do give support or give the leads, intellectual leads, in terms of focusing on minority issues and human rights issues, especially, etc., etc. But let's not exaggerate, frankly. Frankly, which are the countries, or which is the country which has led from the front regime change policies, including in Ukraine, the United States of America? They have the power. They have the economic power. They have the military power. They are capable of sanctioning. They have sanctioned. In fact, the the uh, the extraterritorial jurisdiction of U.S. laws is a big issue between certain major countries of Europe and United States. It's not that Europe doesn't suffer from this. They do. They do. Uh, so these regime change policies, whether it's in Iraq or in Libya or in Syria or the whole Arab Spring, which sort of got rid of established leaders and the turmoil that followed and instability that followed, the Ukraine, the Maidan crisis in 2014, uh, the role of Victoria Nuland, and everything else is well known. So when it comes to regime change, I don't think France is a player at all. Number two, France can't even handle now Africa. where they had actually dominated the scene ever since the 19.
Just one clarification, sir. Just one clarification. It's not France as the government,
No,
just
no,
as
no.
you mentioned, but the elements in France. That's what I'm talking
No,
about. Yeah.
no, no. I understood you, bro, and I was going to
Yeah.
come to
Thank
that. I was going to come to that. That France has not been able to actually affect or even protect regimes. Forget affect regime change. Even protect regimes. Look at the kind of losses they are, political losses. Latest one in Niger that France is uh, having to cope with, including earlier in Mali. And the fear and the Russia not displacing them in certain key countries. In fact, the interesting thing is that the French media and the French uh, diplomatic circles, political circles, are not raking up this issue in a very big way. The loss of French influence in Africa. What I mean is that if they're not able to handle uh, their interests in in areas where colonial, where during the where they have exercised power for decades as a colonial power, they, how can they deal with a country like India? That is the second. The third is that the English language has a lot of advantages in terms of how we operate internationally, but it's a huge issue, huge problem for us. In fact, the biggest problems that we have with regard to destabilizing India from within come from the Anglo-Saxon countries, whether United States or Canada or UK in particular, and also now to some extent Australia. France is not a player. The French newspapers, media, yes, I mean Le Monde and all, they will raise these issues here and there, but it's not on the same terms. The French Parliament doesn't have anything like the U.S. International Commission for Religious Political Freedom, or they dictate to the Elysee or to the government of France that you must have a human rights report and this report and that report and democracy index and stuff like that. No, France is not in that game. And finally, which is important, look at the manner in which Macron treated our prime minister, knowing that in the West and in France, in terms of his media, Le Monde, Libération, or individuals like Jaffrelot, or the or the Sciences Po, as they call, which is their Institute for Political Sciences, or their other research organizations, which take a very negative view of the society in India in certain dimensions. This casteism business, the minority business, and stuff like that. Now, it's not as if the French government is not aware of this. And yet, what does Macron do? Apart from the fact that he shows a lot of personal regard for our prime minister, he invites him to be the chief guest at the Republic Day, then gives him the highest civilian and military honor, the highest which only the presidents and prime ministers of France get, the Grand Cross of the Legion d'Honneur, gives him that. And he's sending a message. He's sending a message also to those extreme left pro-minority lobbies in his own country that whatever you may think, for us, for larger reasons of state, India is a very valuable partner, and we're going to build on that relationship. It is a fact that there is this sniping going on in the extreme left elements in France against India, but it is more on the ground. It has very little impact, frankly, in India. I mean.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is a matter of concern about the regime change, and you brought in a very fascinating element about the English language part of it. That how the Anglo-Saxon elements, that how the English language reporting on India goes unabated, and every Indian reads that. People get to know of it much faster. The French story doesn't get covered because somebody has to translate it. This is a very fascinating observation that you made. And the question then arises is, How does one deal with that? Because earlier आपने कहा था कि there are, US State Department and the US government has created institutional framework through which certain issues are raised. It is never the US government that does it. There are enabled bodies that do that. Why don't we have something similar in India? I mean, in terms of that हमने नहीं कहा, उसने कहा. That is the element of deniability is a big one in the democratic world play. Do you think that Ministry of External Affairs need not have to respond to everything, which is correct? I totally agree. But should we have institutional framework that responds to, a municipality in the US complaining about 370? So, hey, maybe Kadapa and Kadaluru also can write a memorandum that how the Chicago killings are affecting lives of people.
You're right. It might give us some degree of emotional satisfaction that we have done that. But its international resonance would be nil. Who would pick it up? Who would be interested in it? I mean, I've been saying in a different context that when an editorial in the New York Times or article in The Economist or in the Washington Post against India is published, the people all over the world, English speaking, and not only English speaking, they read it. They read it. And it colors their thinking. Because at the end of the day, these papers have credibility in the eyes of their own readership. So it has, as I said, international resonance. If Times of India or Hindustan Times writes an editorial on some of the issues which you just mentioned, or whether it's racism in the United States or mass or these gun laws and everything else, yes, you can write it, but even if PTI circulates, nobody will print it. So therefore, you would have done something for your internal satisfaction, but it has no audience abroad. So in that sense, in terms of input-output ratio, I don't think there'll be much in that. Now, what sometimes I feel is this, but which won't happen because our media, frankly, if you allow me to say so, our media sometimes give the impression that we are a banana republic. That their pages are open to local ambassadors, to visiting dignitaries, who are then asked leading questions. What do you think about our Indian policy on Ukraine? What do you think about the charges that democracy in India is backsliding? In fact, they give them the opening to pronounce on our internal affairs. And why they do that? One or two reasons. One, of course, is that they may have a certain kind of political slant of their own. But I think it's also a fact that they're looking for some scholarships or some visits, some kind of benefits that they might get, visas or whatever else from these Western embassies. And I've commented on this repeatedly. I've been in the diplomatic thing for 41 years. I've seen how difficult it is for a foreign ambassador in a serious country to be able to explain his government's views in the columns of that paper. They don't allow this. But in our case, every other day, this is being done. So the thing is that in some senses, the fact that we are an open society, we're a democratic society, we are divided within, we are becoming polarized within in ways that America is polarized. This is giving more and more opening to foreign interests to actually to try and create domestic issues for us and weaken governance, and of course the reduce to the extent that they can the positive impact of the policies of the government in trying to build up a modern India. But to come back to your question, precise question, I would have felt that if we were to put the local embassies, Western embassies, on the defensive by, like the Washington Post and New York Times and Economist and others, by writing constantly articles that bring out the deficiencies of their democratic system, the huge problems of minorities in their country, the lack of integration, everything else, and put the foreign embassies on the defensive, that they begin to feel that their countries have an image problem in India, and therefore this needs to be addressed. That is one way to go. But then we say our press is free; they'll do what they want. I don't want to listen to what people like I or anybody else and actually government may tell them to do. So it's a very difficult game.
It's a difficult game, and I'm reminded of John F. Kennedy's speech, which I've heard myself, not live, but when I saw the video of that. He said, he said, we are not going to the moon because it's easy to do so. We are going to the moon because it's difficult to do so. So when an assignment is difficult, that's what makes it challenging and interesting. So I take the cue from you that, the editorials and the media that does, but we have technology on our side now, which is a big enabler in dissemination of information. And to that end, we must use that fully. That's one thing very important today. For example, yesterday, Friday, there was a major discussion on Twitter Space, which is now known as X Space, where Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy both were there. And Vivek said something fascinating. He says, he was being asked, would you stay for a little longer or not? And he said, I'm loving it. This would not be possible if this space didn't exist. And 45,000 people were listening to that conversation. And Vivek said, I'm going to stay for a little while longer because it's good fun to be here. Not a single political entity has done that, what Vivek did yesterday. That's the point which I'm trying to say, that India is at the cusp of technology revolution, which we are witnessing. क्योंकि आपके और हमारे ज़माने में घर पे फोन है तो बड़ी इज्जत की बात होती थी. Today, who talks about a phone, right? So we have an advantage of technology that we can definitely ride on. But in the remaining time that we have, I wanted to touch upon two things. One is you talked about the Garcetti phenomenon, as I call the Indian media thing, that they go bend backwards to ask the foreign ambassadors for things, as you rightly said. How do you find Garcetti's questioning and going and meeting Shah Rukh Khan and others as a diplomat? I mean, would you do that if you were in France or Turkey to meet people and do that? How is that allowed as a part of a diplomatic immunity or a freedom of speech?
Well, going and meeting Shah Rukh Khan is fine. It's all right. He knows that he's a politician. He knows how to draw publicity to himself. And meeting Shah Rukh Khan would obviously catch the eye of the media and, give him visibility. So I can understand he wants to be in the limelight. A professional diplomat may think that he has better things to do than going and talking to a film star, unless of course there was some project on which the government was working in the cinematic area, where you needed Shah Rukh Khan to, in some way or the other, to be a part of it or whatever else. Unless it was that kind of a professional approach, I think a professional diplomat would not want to actually go and start cultivating film stars. But I think far more problematic is his statement on Manipur, where he offered to help in case help was sought. Now, that was, to my mind, he was absolutely out of line. He was pronouncing on a very complex, difficult internal situation in India, and assuming that the United States could play a role if asked, forgetting that which government, much less in this government, would ask the United States to intervene in a domestic matter. Haven't we had enough of, not that is happening today, but haven't we had enough of US intervention in the Kashmir issue in the past. So why do we want to get them involved in the Manipur issue? That was wrong on his part. And in his own congressional hearings, he talked about cultivating subnational entities in India and the civil society in India. Why does he need to cultivate the civil society? I mean, this lady, this Uzra, who came to India, she's the Undersecretary for Human Rights. I don't know what she is, and she wanted to meet the civil society and activists. Why do they want to meet them? What for? That's not their job. That's not their job. That's not part of a normal diplomacy, where you announce beforehand that you're going to meet the civil society and talk about inclusiveness and something else she said about inclusiveness and marginalized communities. The marginalized communities, is it the responsibility of the US State Department in foreign countries? This is a source of a this is a potential source of difficulties in dealing with the United States. This happened in the past. Earlier on, this Cobra Gadi affair was mentioned. It is the US ambassador at that time, the lady ambassador, who played a negative role in all this. But these are the problems I think we are realistically aware of when we deal with the United States. How we are able to curb the enthusiasm of people like Garcetti, not to go beyond a certain red line of ours, would be something that we would need to keep an eye on. I remember that before he joined, Shankar was asked this question, that how are you going to handle it? He says, "Pyar se samjha denge." So I don't know to what extent he's been able to do that with pyar, but if pyar doesn't work, then maybe less necessary.
सिबल साहब, जब आपने जयशंकर जी का नाम लिया तो it is important for me to ask that question. I'm a little disturbed that the fact that in America, and without naming names, there are people here in Virginia and DC area who are not mincing words in asking or conveying to Prime Minister that this external affairs minister needs to go. They are not mincing their words. I can share some of those words said in the forums. So much so that in one of the forums, one person in DC asked another colleague of his, "It's time for us to make sure that Jaishankar goes. He is focusing more on Rahul Gandhi than otherwise." How do you respond to that? And I'm disturbed as an Indian living in America, as an American. I don't like Indians talking openly about removing Jaishankar. A campaign is on. Your take on this? This is the final question of the day.
Look, I mean, I'll give you my honest opinion. I know when people say I'm going to give you my honest opinion, they think you're not going to be very honest. That aside, I mean it.
Sure.
I think Jaishankar is doing an excellent job. He's very active as a foreign minister. Look at the amount of physical effort he's putting in terms of spreading India's message, cultivating foreign leaders in all geographies. This has not been done before by our foreign ministers, who, apart from the fact that they didn't have the same kind of energy, but were also politicians, and they had to look after their constituencies. They couldn't devote that much time and effort to actually do diplomacy on the ground in various parts of the world. Number two, I've seen him in action in terms of addressing the challenges that India faces in his press conferences, in his interaction with think tanks and this and that. I think he's able to handle questions very well. He's able to frame India's thinking in a very plausible manner. He has angered a few people in the West by his plain talk at times about asking the Europeans and the Western people to reflect upon their own issues and problems and deficiencies before lecturing India and stuff like that. Now, I don't know the people that you are mentioning whether they are a part of that kind of a lobby, which is not happy at some of the robust position uh, he takes. Uh, there may be others who may have some uh, personal reasons. I can't see what they could be to snap at him, but leave that aside. I think there are many people in the United States who are against Modi, against Prime Minister himself, and speak openly against him. Uh, so, as to what are the levers behind, as to who are pulling these levers, who are behind all this, I cannot say. But I can't see any intellectual reason or any fact which would justify the call for the removal of the foreign minister. Because you can say this, but then you have to then give your arguments why you're saying. Now, unless the people who spoke to you or you're aware of have spelled out the reasons why they say this, is very difficult for me to be able to precisely counter the line of argument that they may have.
Sibal Saab, thank you so much for taking the time, enjoying your Paris stay to talk to us. Thanks to technology, we are able to connect. At the same time, technology led to the disruption of Dr. Adityanji being here because he has some storm-related technology issue. He could not rejoin. But my deepest gratitude to you for being on this program today. You are familiar with Jaipur Dialogue. You are familiar with us. We have met. We have been on the show together to talk about issues.
Yes.
So thank you very much for joining. Enjoy your Paris stay. Viewers, please like, subscribe, and support our channel because we bring you conversations which very few do. Thank you. And as I always say, Satyamev Jayate.